All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for staying until Friday for us. My co-chair, Descartes, was unable to make it here, so I will have the show all to myself. And let's start. Please notice the note well. Everything we talk about is covered by IETF IPR rules. We have a minutes taker, we have a Jabber scribe, and we will soon have the blue sheets. And while we're at it, I'd like to thank our outgoing AD, who obviously took an early flight home, and welcome our incoming AD, Ben. And let's start. So, since the last meeting, we progressed the first working group document, the set format document to ISG. Should be going into IETF last call soon. And today we will spend most of our time discussing the delivery draft/drafts, if that's what we decide to do. But first, I'd like to ask if there are any questions about the agenda. So, can you please speak to the mic? We do have one remote participant.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. There's been some discussion on the list just in the past couple of days about the EXP claim in SET and whether that should be not recommended or recommended. Do we want to make 5 or 10 minutes for that?
So I was planning to do that, assuming we have someone who can represent Marius's concerns on that. So that would be you?
I think I can make a stab at it.
All right. And then Phil asked for a slot, again, if we have some time remaining, to say a few words about SSTP, the new proposal that is submitted just tonight. So again, if we have some time remaining, after we finish talking about the main meat of the meeting. So next is Mike.
Thank you. I'm Mike Jones from Microsoft and one of the editors of the Security Event Token draft. I have 2 slides, one of which was the title slide. So let's go to the second slide.
Let's do that.
This is just recap of status. We have published 4 drafts since we last met our heroes in Singapore. There's been a lot of productive working group discussion that included some consensus calls that didn't result in actual IETF-style consensus, and then some follow-up discussions, both in person and on the list, that eventually did. So I'm happy with that outcome. I think we have a better result than we would have had we just proceeded in December. So thank you, Yaron. Among other things, we tightened up the claims definitions in numerous ways, partly due to input from Annabelle and Dick. We added risk examples that Marius supplied us. And I'm happy that we're now in a state where we've sent it to the IESG and we'll have IETF last call. It is scheduled to be evaluated by the IESG on the May 10 telechat. So those of you who may not have been around this process as much before, expect to see a number of reviews from special groups in the IETF, such as the Security Directorate, the Operations Directorate, the Applications Group will send us reviews that are sort of IETF-wide that often contain a lot of really useful content, as well as a number of the area directors will submit reviews, and the editors in the working group will get to resolve those comments, probably continuing to improve the draft. That is all, unless people have discussions they want to have on that topic now. Otherwise, I will yield the remaining 12 minutes or whatever of my slot to more productive use. Thank you.
Thank you. It works. Well, there's actually no reason why it should work. So no.
If it works with PDFs,
So
it only works with
yeah,
slides.
it'll need to be manual.
Okay, well. Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Going to be talking about the set token delivery using HTTP draft, which is currently one draft, and as Yaron alluded to, may or may not end up becoming two drafts. Next. For those of you who haven't necessarily read it, aren't necessarily familiar with it, what we're talking about is a protocol, or actually potentially two protocols for delivering sets from what we're calling an event transmitter, the party who has the set, probably the party who generated it, to an event receiver, the party that wants a set. We have two mechanisms for this. One that focuses on, we're calling it HTTP push. The transmitter is making a request to the receiver to send the set to them. The other is HTTP poll, where the receiver is making requests to the transmitter to retrieve the sets from the transmitter. So go next. Just kind of walk through these real quick. As I said, with HTTP push, it's a transmitter sending the set to the receiver. They make a post. The receiver replies with a 202 if they accept it, or a 400 if they don't. Just quickly walk through what these look like at the protocol level. You just step through these quickly. Yeah. It's nothing too surprising. The 400 on a 400, we have an error body with an error code and a description for the transmitter to consume. Next. The other side is HTTP poll. Receiver is making posts to the transmitter and retrieving 0 or more sets, depending on if there are any sets available for them. In the initial request, they're going to make a post. They're going to, they can optionally specify a number of sets they want back, a maximum number. They can also specify whether or not they want to do long polling via the return immediately parameter there. The transmitter replies with a 200 that may contain some number of sets, it may not. On subsequent calls, the receiver, in addition to requesting sets, they can also acknowledge receipt of sets they got in the previous request. So they can send this ACK parameter that contains a list of JTIs from sets that they accepted. Next. They can also send this set error parameter, which is a map of JTIs to error responses for those sets. So you put that all together. This is what a request from the receiver might look like. They can specify max events. They can say if they want long polling. They're acknowledging they're specifying errors, and hopefully they get back some sets from the transmitter. Next. So where are we at with this? We had a new draft published just a few weeks ago. One minor open issue, one major open issue. The minor open issues, there was a recent question around how do we want to handle error codes for in the push scenario. Currently, the spec says we're just going to return 400 for everything. Do we want to do something different? The other open issue is we have two protocols in one spec. Which one's MTI? What are we doing there? We'll get into that. As far as implementations go, Google has push implemented. Amazon is working on a push implementation, should have interop with Google on that probably this summer. I understand from Tony that Microsoft is or has implemented poll. I don't know if Mike can clarify that.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Microsoft has needs for both pull and push. I can't speak to the state of our current implementations, but I know that we're implementing and using forms of both. So we need both.
Okay, so next. So let's talk through the error open issue real quick. We saw this briefly in the protocol examples, but for both push and pull, we have this error object has an error code and a description. Next. In the push use case, requests by the transmitter are going to be responded to by the receiver with either a 200 or a status code 400, regardless of what the actual error message is. It was raised on the list that maybe we could be more specific with our status codes here. A couple of things came out of that discussion so far, namely that for two of these, we could actually specify a 403. This error is probably actually not needed and we can get rid of it. But that still leaves everything else as a 400. So there's kind of still an open question. Is it worth doing any of this? Do we just want to stick with 400 for everything and be consistent? Or are there actually other status codes that we're not thinking of that we could use for some of these use cases?
Phil Hunt, document editor, and from Oracle. Raise a caution here that this is similar to issues we've had with redefining JOT attributes for a different purpose. What happens in 403 is you're redefining something that HTTP has defined. It also causes a problem that you can't tell the difference between an authorization error and a JWT error. So I'd advise against redefining 403 in this way. Thanks.
William Dennis, Google. We actually had a similar question come up with the device flow draft in OAuth, where we had like a slowdown that could have fit into one of the HTTP ones. We ended up just keeping the 400 in that case. And some of the reasons were that, this is a JSON reply anyway, so it's kind of like it's machine readable. So I think the thing about status codes in HTTP is that if it's an HTML response, it's really the status code that's kind of telling the browser like what actually happened, so the browser can display perhaps a meaningful message. Because the HTML, while kind of machine readable, is not really machine processable. In this, we don't have this problem here, so I think each of these error messages are very explicit anyway. The other thing was adding the separate I think it was like a 410 or something. It just meant like it just adds more branches to the client code, kind of more places people can get things wrong. So yeah, I would probably advocate just keeping it as the 400 too.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty compelling argument. I also think there's something to be said for leaving the other status codes at the sort of HTTP level and not getting into the application level that's running on top of the HTTP protocol here.
Could you explain why dup was stricken out?
I'd have to go back to the email thread, but I think it looks like Phil has a better answer than I do.
It was because when we talked about possibilities for a failed delivery, the transmitter needs to have the ability, if it thinks that the receiver may not have received it, to send it again. And it will keep trying within some reasonable period that it's able to do that until it gets an acknowledgement back.
Right.
So a duplicate is now a normal condition was the issue.
Right. So I think we don't have, I think the draft does not currently make clear that that's the case. And so that's probably something we need to update, is to add some language about idempotency of sending a set to a receiver.
I'm pretty sure it's clear. It's just that we're all remembering from the past. That's really the issue.
That's possible. Other question, push versus pull. Should one of these be MTI? Should the other be MTI? Should they both be MTI? Should neither of them be MTI? This is the big question of the day. We've gone back and forth over this issue in several meetings, and I don't think we've really made a lot of progress on it. There are arguments for both protocols. There's legitimate technical reasons people have given for preferring one versus the other. I think the biggest concern that's been raised for polling, why people would not necessarily want to use polling, is there are scaling concerns there. On the other hand, for push, the enterprise space has scenarios where they maybe don't want to open holes in firewalls. So opening up an endpoint that transmitters would push sets to doesn't necessarily work for them. It's a big technical reason.
Point of clarification on
Mhm.
the poll. There's no mandatory requirement to persist sets. It is obviously slower if your polling cycles are long, whereas in push, you can get rid of it relatively immediately. So you might be talking about retaining the set, not persisting it for a period of minutes rather than milliseconds. So that is the trade-off. So there is, but it's not a permanent requirement. That's what I want to clarify.
Yes, that's not, yeah, the slide says persist. That's not meant to imply permanence of that, but it does mean that the transmitter has to hold on to the set, all of their sets, for potentially a longer period of time, whereas with push, they generate it, potentially they push it immediately, they get a 202 back, and they're done with it.
I'm wondering. Oh, sorry, Leif Johansson. I'm wondering whether you have to think about a little bit the MTI for the client and the server here, or the sender and the receiver, and it might be asymmetric. So you might sort of try push and then have text in the specification that says how you fall back to pull if that fails, right? Or what the expectation is on the sender and the receiver to make it sort of maximize your chances of interoperability. It's just a thought.
William Dennis, Google. And I apologize for the auth analogies again, but that's kind of my background. When I analyzed the MTI, and I sent a couple of emails yesterday on this topic, the two good examples I found from auth where having MTI really, really helped was when there was kind of like a recommended way to do something and then like an inferior way for like some subset of kind of constrained clients. So in a number of places, we mandated the superior way, and then we made the inferior way kind of optional. That has been extremely useful for clients, because if the client is capable of the superior way, they can just implement. They don't have to worry about, working out what they need to do. That was extremely valuable. In this case, I feel like these two things are just completely diametrically different. So to me, this is just kind of two aspects of something. It's kind of like, again, the OAuth analogy. We have the code flow and we have the implicit flow, and I don't actually think either are like MTI. There's also like client credentials and various other kind of all this optionality in the spec, and people kind of have to, each had its own use case. And what I'm sort of seeing here is that there is very explicit use cases for each. I don't see how MTI actually would aid the development of clients. And there was the option of like splitting the spec. Maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe it's just like other specs that we have that just document two options, and there's discovery or something that people use to work out which one it is. It seems like this is a really kind of big topic that people will choose and not sort of trivial, like using SHA or using like something else where it makes sense. That's just that's my opinion. And I think I'm speaking for the team there on that.
I'd like to make two comments. One is one is working group chair and one is individual. As working group chair, I believe very strongly in the value of having a single MTI. I think in a few years' time, when there's less clarity actually about what we thought of as the appropriate use case for each one, people will need to open their documents and find out what to implement first, what to implement for smaller libraries, for smaller identity providers that want to interact with larger guys. So I think we need to give them one direction about that. Even if that means that some people in this room might even start with the other method because that makes more sense for them today. But still, we need to have one preferred option. And then as an individual, I think, so I don't really believe the everyone thing. I think
So they're saying in the job room that they can't hear you.
So as an individual, I think the question of firewall holes is not as problematic as it's made out to be here. And so I don't see a problem with having push as the MTI. But again, as a working group chair, I just want one. I don't really care which one it is.
So just a flip side to something you said there is talking about a few years down the line when a lot of these conversations and these arguments are forgotten. The flip side to that is a few years down the line, we'll have a few years of implementation experience. And I think a much better idea at that point of which of these protocols make sense in what circumstances. Ultimately, the answer for the little guy who wants to work with the big guy is they're going to implement whatever the big guy implemented, 9 times out of 10.
Yes, but we're going to have multiple big guys, and we still want to send a signal. That's what standards are about.
Hi, Phil Hunt again. There's a lot of cases I think we're considering mainly that are due to federation. Those cases, when I look at logout, are relatively simple. When I look at other cases, we're talking about interconnecting highly proprietary and highly secure security systems. So we're not actually talking about an age of sharing security signals between security centers, which the methods behind them are restrictive. They're the keys to the castle that everybody has. And I'm expecting severe network restrictions. Another category is that many people are classic business customers who are on a trend to close firewalls further, not open them. Their argument is if we're moving services to the cloud, what's left inside our castle is even more important, and they're reticent to open it. So regardless, I see network challenges. Oh, and the last category was there are some Internet of Things cases that come up, gatewaying issues, you see TLS 1.3 issues that limit choices. So push seems simple now, and I agree it's the more performant one. But in terms of agility, about usability, I'm worried. So I'm thinking in terms of applicability and agility in general, and trying to balance the needs of saying, let's just solve federation and scope it to that. I think if we're here at the IETF, solving federation is not the majority. Well, it's current majority, but it's not the long-term use case. And I think we have broader use plans for it as well. Thanks.
That all sounds to me like a really good argument for not trying to institute a single MTI set delivery spec. As you noted, I think there's going to be use cases for set for which neither of these make sense, and for which they may not be using any delivery method at all. You mentioned IoT. I think that's a great example of where push and pull both are probably not going to work in their current design.
Correct. Phil, again, I think my hesitation is not based on, I agree with you. My hesitation is what will the broader IETF community accept, and based on what William's told and in my personal experience over the 10 years, we can say we want something all we want, but my concern is if we want to get it done, taking a chance by having two optional things and having it thrown back delays us significantly. And if we can come to a single method, that would be the ideal case. That would be the fastest case that I see. It's still problematic because there may be a lot of changes required to adopt a single method. So we're kind of in a quandary. I don't know what to do about it, and this is where I have to go back to the chair and the AD's recommendations to say, you're wasting your time or not to pursue the multiple method approach. It's just my feeling based on experiences that people want libraries to be developed, and the libraries will generally work with each other when people try to use it. And I think Leif's comments are important about client option versus server options. You have to we have to get that clearly meshed together. Thanks.
My feeling is you don't get what you don't ask for. If we collectively as a working group agree that one or the other is the right technical choice to move forward with, if we think that's the right answer, then we should let the IETF fight us on it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that comment. I think it's our job to put forward the best document we can. Kind of a point of order, I'd like to ask the chair, I don't quite understand how you can sort of say it's like there should be MTI with your chair hat on. To me, that's more of an individual comment. I've not heard of a chair kind of requiring an MTI in a spec.
Can I comment on that? So I actually think that's it. It's just experience, right? ISG will bring this up, right? But it's also, Annabelle is absolutely true. Right? I mean, we don't. It doesn't mean you actually have to just buy that, right? So you can, if the working group has consensus, the working group has consensus, right? A well-documented consensus saying there is like good reason to have two, right?
Yeah. OAuth has multiple methods, multiple flows in it for good reason, and that's standardized.
Yeah, and in that example, there were very explicit use cases for each of those two, and I think that analogy applies here. So, in OAuth we had the JavaScript clients, and we had public clients, we had confidential clients. They're all very different. Right. What my observation here is that when I sort of saw that argument between the two groups, like we want pull, we want push, it just seemed like they were just completely separate ecosystems as well. Sort of a bunch of people doing something, say with risk implementation there, a bunch of people maybe doing something with Skim. And I think if you go back to why do we want MTI, it's kind of to improve interoperability and to simplify things. But it seems like there's no interoperability issue there. So I don't sort of see how forcing one method on a group of people that don't really want to do it, that are all kind of happy with their interop, helps. And yeah, I do think there is precedent for documenting two equally viable methods. So yeah, my suggestion would be let's take that forward, and if there's significant pushback, we can address it then.
And I think there's probably an action item there for those of us who are authors of the draft to add more context around what are the use cases here, what's motivating push, what's motivating pull. I think that's something that you do see in 6749 that isn't really present in this draft, and that might help clarifying and give that context for why both of these methods make sense.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I think there's plenty of evidence in the room and on the list that both methods are going to be used for good reasons in different use cases. That being the case, I think we are procedurally better off to keep them in one draft and have discussions about whether one is MTI separately than that. But if I were trying to take 2 drafts to the ISG, and I would then expect comments like pick, choose one or the other. Whereas if we have one draft that clearly lays out, for these kinds of use cases, this method works. For these kinds of use cases, this other method works. And for this other set of use cases, either could work. Then we're not going to start having discussions about delete one or the other.
Mike, you're stealing the thunder on my next 2 slides here.
Well, please proceed, Annabelle.
Just one more thing. So, first of all, I'd like to echo what Lev said about my previous comment coming from experience, and about the working group ultimate decision on whether we want to go with a single MTI or not. It's my advice to have a single MTI, and the working group can decide otherwise if it wants to. And then back to the discussion on which, whether and which. So I'm a bit worried about when I hear that there are going to be additional methods proposed for various use cases. So if we start with having 2 methods that are both sort of optional, sort of describing which use case for which, what do we do when the 3rd and 4th ones come along? And then when I hear that we have clearly defined use cases, oh well, that kind of conflicts with with the whole firewall hole notion. So if I have a firewall hole, that's a clear use case. Now, is it really? It's just a matter of getting hold of my IT guy at a good time or something. It's not really a well-defined use case.
The slides back up.
Yes, sorry.
So let's look at a bunch of slides about what we just talked about. Yeah. So briefly, before we get to the ones we actually just talked about, one additional option that's been brought up, particularly for the kind of the firewall use case, is the idea that a lot of those clients may actually be operating through sort of a service provider acting as a proxy between their systems and the event transmitters that they actually want to get signal from. So as you can see in this example, we've got transmitter talking push to the proxy service provider who's acting as an intermediary receiver. On the other side, you have the receiver polling the proxy service provider to get those events. So in this scenario, you're still doing push and you're doing poll, but it's a question of who's implementing what. The transmitter is only implementing one of these protocols. The service provider is implementing both, but they're implementing them in different directions. And the receiver is also only implementing one of these protocols. So even with 2 protocols and people wanting to implement different ones, you still got ways to bridge between them that, you know, if the use case is there, the industry can provide.
I saw this posted on the list, and my reaction, it's Phil Hunt, by the way, again, was it doesn't address the interoperability issue because you still have interoperability for the receiver. It has to be standardized. It does, I think it's a natural consequence, though, as a negative of having 2 methods, that then we can expect complication in network architectures of needing mediators between the methods. So I see this actually more as a problem than a solution. I'm not sure how I think it describes the problem more than it does the solution, and I guess I'm stumbling because I'm not sure where we go with it on that one. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I think Adam Dawes was probably the first person to bring up this approach. And if I understand it correctly, he's putting it forward not as a replacement or a reason why we don't need to standardize poll. We would want to standardize both push and pull, so you have standardization on both of these links. But the proxy service provider acts as a bridge between the two. So people have made claims that, well, everyone's going to have to implement poll anyway. With the intermediary service provider solution, that may not actually be true. So, other option we've already talked about, splitting the draft. We could do that. There are consequences, though, which we've also already talked about. Thanks, Mike. If we split the draft, what happens when we get to IETF? Thank you. There's concerns, Yaron's brought them up. We've talked about them at length, I think, by now. That's something we have to think about. So, kind of summarize where we're at with this. I think it's worth us considering stepping back a little bit and considering some kind of lower level questions. We talk about wanting a single spec for MTI, a single MTI spec for interoperability. What do we mean by interoperability? Is it reasonable for us to say that everyone or a significant consensus of implementers or users of SET are going to be able to agree on a single delivery method for that? Personally, I think at this point it's probably too early for us to say, but we can talk about that. Separate from that question of whether can we or can't we, if we can, do we need to? Does IETF process mean that we have to? What's the consequences if we don't? Yeah, that's all I've got. Anyone else have any other questions on SET delivery? Then I think we can move on to the next set of slides.
I actually think that we do need to get to closure on this. Otherwise, we will waste another IETF cycle. And maybe before we move forward, I will ask Cliff and maybe Ben to give their opinions on the issue at hand.
So, Leif Johansson again. So, is the working group clear on what the question is at this point? Again, yes, that was my comment on client asymmetry and stuff like that. I mean, if we have that analysis in hand, it may actually be easy to answer that question. But skipping over that issue, I would say that I hear the chair's recommendation, but I actually think the working group should recognize the fact that the major implementations are already said that it will do both, and write that as a recommendation in the draft that you should expect, and with explicit analysis on what the client should be, how the client should behave, right? How the sender should behave. Here's what you should expect, and here's what you need to implement in order to achieve interoperability, and it will be both. And I would advocate keeping it all in one draft, as Mike said.
Yeah. William, apologize for going back to it, but I think OAuth is actually a good model to look to here as far as the value and the need for different methods.
Ben Kaduk speaking as AD. So, I mean, Yaron is right that it is frequently useful to try and push for a single MTI solution that's best for interoperability in general. It's, of course, also true that if the working group has good consensus to do something else, that will go forward in the process. And generally, the IESG review stage is only going to object to that strongly if there are actual technical flaws with it. And they're supposed to reject the working group. They're supposed to respect, very different, respect the working group consensus. In this particular case, you could perhaps think about it as being that the set is a information model, and there are different applications that want to use the information model, which require different MTI protocols. And so if you frame it in that way, there's perhaps less of an objection. But I am not super up to speed with the actual use cases here, so I can't confirm for sure that that's what's going on.
That's actually something that has also been brought up. I don't think anyone mentioned it here, but SET is going to be profiled by applications. Risk is profiling it, OIDC logout is profiling it, others will. And those profiles can and likely will mandate one or another delivery method as MTI for different use cases and for different contexts. So I think that speaks to your point that SET really is the it's the information model. It's a format. Here we're talking about how we're delivering that naturally gets into the use cases for that format, the applications are being used within. And yeah, I think that's where we do get into a lot of risk trying to say it's all going to be one way or the other.
And I guess thinking this way might make one tempted to split into 3 documents, but I also share some worries that that would not go terribly well in practice.
Any other questions or comments on SET delivery before we move on? Take that as a no.
What? The next presentation?
Oh, yeah.
No, so I suggest that you take a seat. We will take a few hums, and then we'll move to the
And
next
then I'll
one.
come right back up here.
Mhm. Thank you, Annabelle.
Hum too. Did you catch that?
So my rather ambitious plan is to take 3 hums, one on whether we want a single MTI method. If the answer is yes, which one it should be, whether push or pull, because these are the 2 ones that we actually have on the table. And then a hum on whether we want to split the draft. Comments, objections, questions? I will clarify the hums more as we move into them, but please.
So, John Bradley, as it was pointed out by, I think, one of the speakers, the MTI doesn't necessarily need to be symmetric for both the client and the server. So it's confusing to me, your question, is this that there should be a single MTI that both client and server must implement? I think there's more options than what you enumerated.
Would you like to enumerate the options? We could hum on them.
You're smarter. Come on.
I think I'm not sure I can do it sort of standing up, but I think you actually have to sit down and do a little bit of analysis and think about sort of the various scenarios in which push and pull can fail, because I think that's where people are going to go from push to pull and pull to push, right?
Yeah, just a follow up. I mean, there's also, we always get into the tangle of what is mandatory to implement versus what is mandatory to deploy, and they wind up not being the same thing. Well, it is a confusion, at least in the minds of potential hummers.
Okay, we're talking mandatory to implement. That's like IETF religion.
Yeah, but mandatory to implement does not mean that people actually turn on the functionality, which means that you may not actually get the interoperability so desired.
Correct.
So, the difference between a open source project must include the functionality in a library they distribute versus it must be enabled for a particular implementation.
Yes.
They're not the same thing.
Regarding client MTI versus server MTI, I don't think that's actually a relevant distinction here, because client and server are dictated by the protocol you're using, what role you're in, and what you're doing. Each of these protocols is unidirectional. So if we're talking HTTP push, the transmitter is acting as a client, making calls to the receiver who is hosting an endpoint. If we're talking about pull, it's flipped around.
I don't think that's
You meant transmitter, receiver.
Transmitter, receiver.
It's, I mean, that's sort of the fundament. That's the question, though. Like, you can't say one is MTI for transmitter, one is MTI for receiver, because they necessarily have to be functioning in the appropriate role within the protocol. A transmitter implementing push is only going to be able to send messages to a receiver who's implementing push in the receiver role. Same thing for poll.
Hi, Justin Richer. So I think that we could approach this hum in a couple of different ways. It's we may want to take a hum specifically from the perspective of the transmitter. Say, should push be implemented? Should push be MTI for transmitter? Should poll be MTI for transmitter? If we wanted to, we could take the same hums from the perspective of the receiver. In addition to those, I think those two, at the very least, are necessary. And people can hum for both if you think we should have both, or you can make that a separate option that both should be MTI. To Annabelle's very salient point, though, the receiver doesn't really have a choice here. This is not the kind of protocol where you can like try one and then negotiate the other when it fails. It's either going to be there or it's not, because they are just drastically different models from each other. That's the whole confusion about client versus receiver and stuff like that, right? So I think, in my view of looking at this, that MTI from the client's perspective is dictated by whatever, see, I'm doing it now. MTI from the receiver's perspective is dictated by whatever the transmitter supports. So I think that we should, at the very least, get a sense for what people think should be MTI for the transmitter to support. If we want to do all of this other stuff for clarity on top of that, sure, but I think this is the fundamental question, and it's a narrower question than what was being asked before.
So transmitter, Phil Hunt here, transmitter and receiver are, the app layer concept. The way you have to look at it, or I look at it, is that at the receiver's perspective, they have a choice that boils down to HTTP. Are they able to be an HTTP endpoint or not? So if you're a mobile app, probably not. If you're an IoT device behind a number of gateways and security things, probably not. You have a hard choice. So it's not a question of MTI. You're either able to be an HTTP endpoint or not. The server, the transmitter, if they want to share events to both of those classes of custom clients that, receivers that receive events, some of them can be an HTTP endpoint and some cannot. So I think what will naturally happen is major issuers or transmitters will have to do both, but certain clients, if you're building an IoT device, you're only going to be able to implement one, because that's all you have to work with. So clients have the optionality, but not really. They're driven by what they can do. And so MTI becomes a bit nebulous, and that's why we're having trouble with it. I also then, just to make people go tilt, I'm seeing a lot of use cases that are bidirectional anyways. And the whole problem repeats as you reverse transmitter-receiver roles. So that's something to think about how this evolves and where complexity lies. But in general, those that are behind some network restrictions are going away. I understand, by the way, Yaron's comments about the firewall. I was that way 2 years ago when we started and was behind push all the way. I'm finding it's a hard no. They won't do that. It's a little bit like TLS 1.3. They're getting rid of things that support man in the middle. That's now a hard no. So, and it's the same thing that are happening with many firewall configurations. While the device and the standards support it. The deployers do not. So we have to worry about that.
So I think a lot of what Phil said is actually about the confusion between mandatory to implement and mandatory to deploy. And in practice, mandatory to deploy is going to wind up with everything, because that's what people will have to do in order to handle all the use cases. I actually came up with something else, but I find myself agreeing with Justin. I think that it's a good question to ask to hum on mandatory to implement for the transmitter, because I think that's sort of the core library function that everybody has to support. Another option is to do a hum on whether we actually want to try to avoid the MTI discussion by saying both, and do that hum first. But I'm sort of in Justin's camp here and say let's hum on mandatory to implement for transmit.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I think we should be careful about making assumptions that transmitters are going to have to implement, both protocols or all protocols. Implicit in that is the assumption that every transmitter is going to have use cases that require both, and that may or may not be the case. There may be transmitters who don't care about and don't have use cases for getting events from clients who can't act as a HTTP server. There may be applications for SET where that concept just doesn't apply. So it's a little presumptuous at this point to assume that regardless of which is MTI, that every transmitter is going to have to do push and pull.
You pointed out the IoT devices, and if you think about the MTI, that's actually the IoT devices there is very important, because that's where you want to do minimal implementation. You want to do what is the smallest possible implementation you want to do, and then you want to only implement the MTI algorithm and nothing else. If you implement the MTI implementation in your end, and you probably, as I say in IoT, you usually talk to some bigger device. The bigger device can implement both or whatever it wants. And I don't know actually what the IoT device are going to be using. Is it more useful to use the pull or push for them? I don't know. Depends on the application. That's actually makes it very hard, I think, to understand which one would be better for them. But usually having single MTI is better than having multiple, because that makes it easier. And even if you say you don't have to deploy it, but if the code isn't there, you can't even change the configuration to get them to work together unless you have one single MTI that is implemented, or at least one single MTI that's implemented both ends.
We'll cut the line after William.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I think for the IoT implementers, there are a lot of strategies that they tend to say. I've seen them employ and working with them, in our context, that protect them from these sorts of decisions. Frequently, we've seen, regardless of whatever protocol, whatever standard protocol we want them to be talking to us with, inevitably they'll plumb everything through their data center. So their IoT devices are all calling home to their systems that they can control and they can update, and then they'll talk whatever protocol to us. So to some extent, I think as far as the device side code is concerned, they're largely insulated from these kinds of discussions.
William Dennis, I agree with that viewpoint. I think this comes down to, again, the kind of the application of this set delivery, and that there are different applications for it. So I don't think we have like an IoT use case that's sort of a generic set delivery IoT use case that anyone has been discussing. So I think, again, it's application specific, and therefore the usual kind of interop concerns don't necessarily apply, because it's kind of constrained to the application domain anyway. I think we're expecting that there'll be profiles of this. So as you said, risk will likely have a profile that says, with risk, we're using set, we're using a bunch of events that have been defined by set. We're going to mandate push for that particular profile. And so that's the application that, that governs the interop for that, for that group of people. And any IoT device using risk, can then rely on that profile and the mandatory things specified by it.
Okay, so I think it's time to move to a hum. The first hum will be on the question of MTI for transmitters. Thank you, John. So if it's a yes, means yes, we think we need a single method to be MTI for transmitters. If it's a no, it means we don't think we need an MTI for transmitters, and we as a group believe that we can specify, or we can define use cases and the actual usage scenarios for each of the two methods on the table. Yes, John.
Justin, Richard.
Justin.
It's okay.
Apologies.
John gets credit for most of the stuff I do anyway. Yeah. So in any case, I would actually recommend and request that the hum be between multiple discrete options and not a yes and no hum, as opposed. So MTI for both, MTI for pull, MTI for push, or pull alone, push alone, and then maybe need more info or I don't care.
So
that would be
third
my
would be
recommendation
no
for the structure.
MTI, I suppose.
Okay, that's entirely off mic. Annabelle said that the results depend on the answers to those depend on the results of the other questions, and that may be true.
Yeah, so
I'm just
that
trying
was
to
my
help
original
clarify.
proposal, and let's stick to that.
Okay.
So yes or no on MTI first.
Okay.
And Ben, I will need your help. So please hum if you believe that we need a single method to be MTI for transmitters. Okay. Please hum if you think that we do have a clear enough definition of use cases for each of the two methods. Okay, so the group, not too many hums, but well enough, I think. So the group believes we can go with no MTI and that we can actually specify in the draft. Please go to the mic, Justin.
You see, this is why I was asking for more clarity in the hum. I hummed for 2 MTI and not 0 MTI. I think those are different options, neither of which is 1 MTI, which was the first option that didn't get any. So that's why I was asking you to make it explicit.
Yes, Annabelle.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Yeah, I think the follow-up hum then should be who thinks both of these should be MTI. And a further follow-up,
Versus
who thinks
no
we should split the
MTI.
spec. Yeah.
Fair enough. So please hum now if you think that both push and pull should be MTI. And please hum if you think that that we should not be specifying an MTI method, and basically both of these are good and maybe any others to come along. So please hum now. Sounds sort of half and half to me.
Ben Kadek, I think you should ask the people who hummed for the last one if they could come to the mic and say a little bit about why they hummed.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Annabelle made a point that set is profiled and that profiles are likely to specify particular transport methods as well. And that actually probably argues for no MTI, define the methods and leave it up to the profiles.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon, agreed with Mike agreeing with me. Also, the reason I hummed against making both of these MTI, and the real reason is that because I think we should split the spec, which sort of makes them both MTI for each use case. So it's a little bit weird to say they're not both MTI. Basically, what I'm against is keeping, or what I'd prefer to see is separating them. So if you're doing HTTP push, you're doing HTTP push. Obviously, that becomes MTI for HTTP push. If you're doing HTTP poll, obviously HTTP poll is MTI for that. If you're doing set, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing either one of them.
Justin Richer, given Annabelle's comment just now, I would agree that if we do split the spec, then yeah, that does sort all of that out, fairly cleanly. That said,
Can you explain that to me? Splitting the spec is very procedural.
yeah, so if
very
you split the
technical.
spec, then you don't have one document that says you need to do both documents. You're compliant with the document by doing everything that's in the document, and you can ignore the other document that you're not implementing. It's not just procedural. So in any case, I hummed for both MTI, again, assuming that they stay in the same document, because from the perspective of the transmitter, I think it would be better for interop and better for kind of, the ecosystem for transmitters to support both, because every single comment that I have heard about constraints and being able to support something or not support something has always been on the receiver side. Oh, this receiver won't be able to do that, or this receiver won't be able to do an endpoint, blah, 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 whatever. Transmitters for set, for the most part, aren't going to be as constrained. It's not universally true, I know. There was, for the most part, there are exceptions to every rule. And so that, with that in mind, it may be wise to split this into two things that are different, but keep the same syntax chucked over the wire in a different way.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Justin made good points regarding the proceduralness or not of splitting the spec. To add on that, right now, we have a set draft that says nothing about delivery methods. So people can do set and not do set delivery over HTTP as it is. So we're already in a world where people can and will do set and not use either of these delivery methods. The best we can do at this point from an MTI standpoint is say, these are MTI for people doing set delivery over HTTP. Personally, I don't really see a lot of value and argument for that. I think following the OAuth model here is going to be the better direction for us to go. My concern about making both MTI is we run the risk of trying to tell developers that they have to implement something that makes no sense for their use case. And I think if your standard starts doing that, your standard starts getting ignored. And that's by far worse from an interop standpoint.
William Dennis, the reason I'm against the both being MTI, I think theoretically, to me, it just seems like we have two different groups that can have their own applications and be quite happy in that world. And then practically, and this is something Annabelle mentioned earlier, there are some concerns around scalability, for example. So from a practical sense, the two teams from Google and Amazon that are working on interop are likely not going to be implementing pull. So from a practical sense, it'd be good not to mandate something that we don't plan to actually do. Right. So, I mean, at this point, I would advocate if there is a strong consensus for both being MTI, to me, that's actually indication that we do need two specs. Otherwise, I think neither. That'd be my position.
So, John Bradley, I think splitting the specs and sidestepping the issue is probably the best thing. As Phil pointed out, there are a lot of cases where we may have bidirectionality, and because of network topology, a device acting as a receiver may only be able to do poll, but because of the same network constraints, it can only do push when it's acting as a transmitter. And trying to put MTIs in is just, it's going to be wrong from a deployment scenario in probably the majority of cases. So I think it's just simpler to let the profiles deal with it and split the spec.
So before we hum on that, let me ask if we have editors for both specs, if we move forward with this.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I'd be happy to edit the push spec.
William Dennis, I'm sure someone from my team is happy to be an editor on the push spec. If they're not, then I would be happy to volunteer.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Part of my concern with splitting stuff is there ends up being, when you're specifying multiple delivery methods, a bunch of stuff that's common between them, and then it makes it harder for developers to read. Both if you duplicate the information and try to keep it consistent with, which is a nightmare, or if you only put it in one place and refer to it from the other, both become harder to read than a single spec. So I'm trying to think, what can we do to make developers' lives easier? And I don't think we should split it.
Ben Kaduk. So Mike, do you think that still applies even if there's 3 documents and so the common parts are in a single standalone document that is hopefully easier to read?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest complaints about the Jose work was that we put all the algorithms in a separate draft than the places that uses them. So for instance, all the signature algorithms are in 7518, even though the generic signature is in 7515, and it confuses the heck out of a lot of people. So my experience is no, don't do that again.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I think if you look at the 2 delivery methods in the draft now, the 99% of the overlap between them is set. So it's already in a single place. The only other thing I can think of that that both methods use is like the error signaling, and most of that I believe is coming from JOT anyway. So if that's the concern, I'd suggest we go look at the draft and see if there realistically is actually any significant overlap between the 2 at this point that isn't already standardized somewhere else.
Channeling Marius, he'd be happy to stay editor of push, and also wants to comment that currently there is little commonality between the 2 methods.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. If need be, I'd be happy to edit poll as well, since we have a bunch of volunteers for push. I think it'd be better for somebody who is closer to those use cases to do it, but if we don't have any volunteers, I'd be happy to do it if it means that we can move forward.
Thank you, Annabelle. Do we have anybody who's closer to the poll use case who's willing to edit?
Mike Jones, Microsoft. We're going to build both. We have business cases for both. So I'm willing to work on one as long as I'm also working on the other, because my goal would be to keep them as consistent as possible.
Thank you. Okay, with that in mind, I would propose a hum on whether to split the draft into 2. Please hum yes if you think that we should split the delivery draft into 2 documents, one for push and one for poll. Please hum. Please hum if you think we should leave it as one document. So kind of rough, but I think the room is in favor of splitting the documents. And unless there are objections, I think this wraps up this discussion. So no MTI, 2 documents, you as a transmitter implement one or the other or both. Or neither. And with that,
Thank you, everybody, for working through that. It's nice to actually move forward on that topic. Okay, so this is a little bit different. Some of you may recall around the beginning of the year, there was discussion over whether we want to change the format of the security event token. And one of the elements of that alternative design was this idea of subject identifier types. At the time, it was discussed, hey, maybe this is something we should standardize within SET, but not move forward with a totally different SET draft. That was discussed on list, never went anywhere. Thought I would bring it back up here, show what we're doing with this in the risk working group, and kind of toss it out there to see if people want to pick it up, lift it out of risk and into SEC events. So from the risk standpoint, risk, by the way, for anyone who's not familiar, is risk and incident sharing and collaboration or cooperation. I can never remember which one it is. But the idea here is authorities for identifiers or for an identity can communicate security events about that identity to providers or to services that are relying upon that identity. So we sort of have 2 big use cases for this that we have to think about. The first is the explicit reliance scenario, where you have a party that's actually acting as a relying party to some kind of identity provider, using some protocol where you're getting, you're actually walking through some kind of workflow to establish that relationship. So kind of canonical examples would be the OpenID Connect relying party and the OpenID provider, or kind of in the SAML world, the service provider, depending on the enterprise directory. The other scenario we have are the implicit reliance relationships. This is somebody like Amazon who depends on everybody's email provider implicitly. We don't have formal OAuth-based relationships with them, but we use your email as a recovery mechanism. So if your email account gets compromised, then that potentially impacts other accounts. So there is this implicit dependence there. Actually, go back to that one. Sorry. The challenge this presents for risk is, in all of these scenarios, we are identifying the subject in very different ways. In the explicit use case, you have typically some kind of shared identifier between the relying party and the IDP. In OIDC, it's an issuer and subject. In SAML, it's who the hell knows, whatever it's specified in the metadata. On the implicit side, it's probably something like email address and phone number. Theoretically, it could be other identifiers. The point is that there's a lot of different use cases here. So how do we, within risk, make sure we have a consistent way of saying what kind of identifier we're talking about, how we're identifying these subjects? The solution we have for that is something we termed subject identifier type. And it's basically just a simple way to define a set of claims that we are using to identify a subject. We've defined 4 types within risk: email, phone number, issuer, and subject. And then the 4th one, ID token claims, which I'll show in the example. It'll help explain what that one is. So you can step through just some quick examples. In risk, what we have within our event definitions, if you recall in SET, every event has a capability of having a event body with additional metadata within that. Within risk, we're using this subject claim within that body to represent the subject of the risk event. This allows us to have this kind of multi-part subject where we have n different claims that collectively identify the subject. One of those you can see is subject type. That tells us what kind of subject identifier type we're working with. And then everything else within this subject object is the claims for that type. So step through that. Phone, pretty self-explanatory. Issuer and subject, again, here you can see we've got both issuer and subject claims here, so we know who we're talking about. Importantly, note that the issuer here could be different from the issuer of the set. That's why we're specifying it here. There's no guarantee that the system or the entity that is generating the set is actually the issuer of the identifier. It could perhaps be the relying party who is transmitting events back to the identity provider. And in that case, they want to communicate who they're talking about, what subject they're talking about in a way that the identity provider is going to understand. And the best way for that is this existing shared identifier that they already have. So. The last one is this ID token claims. This is a use case that is important for in the explicit space. As much as we would like as identity providers for all of our relying parties to be performing account linkages based on issuer and subject, the standardized identifiers, that doesn't always happen. A lot of times they will just use email or phone number or some other other claim that is theoretically unique to establish those linkages. And if that's the case, then they're not necessarily in a place to be able to use just issuer and subject. So we introduced this ID token claims type as a way to say, here are all the claims I know about this entity, about this subject. I know you're using one or a couple of these to identify the subject. So here's what I know I've shared with you. You figure out whatever makes sense on your side. Next. So the question, or the reason I'm presenting this, as I said, we talked about this earlier in the working group in the context of a different token draft. We opted not to go that route. Risk has since pulled this concept down to our working group. It's in our draft of the risk profile of SET currently. People had expressed interest in the idea, so we want to raise the question: should do we want to take this work back up into Secevent and make a, say, Secevent subject identifier type draft, something along those lines? Now, and I'll note within risk, we are defining this in an open way. We're defining an IANA registry for these things. So theoretically, we could standardize it in risk, and other people could use it, but it might be a little bit weird.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Per the in-person discussions at Cisco when we had the editors meeting, I would be thrilled to work on this with you because I think it's of general applicability. You actually just made an argument why it has to be in the IETF that you may not realize you just made, because if you're defining an IANA registry, it must be an RFC.
That's a good argument.
Specifications cannot do that.
They can't define an IANA registry at all? But you can specify.
Third-party specifications can register values. They cannot establish registries.
But you can define processes for managing the registry that don't involve the IETF.
Right. Well, can you? I mean, you have.
I know you can do the latter because I read the RFCs that say you can.
All right. You think about the designated expert thing?
Yeah, that, and
But
then
that's
the
still gonna
process
be-
for editing
They're gonna
and
be
altering the registry.
Aren't they going to be appointed by the ISG anyway?
Designated experts tend to get approved by the ISG. There are other, there are multiple registry rules that you can put on the registry, some of which are more flexible than others. I believe there is even a first come, first served, which of course doesn't require anything. Designated expert is most flexible, or specification required, which also comes with an expert. I believe that generally when you use specification required, they want an expert with it as well.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we're a little bit in the weeds here because the proposal on the table is to actually have it as a Secevent document.
Yeah, I came up here to support that. I think it's an excellent idea, and it should be expert review policy, I think.
William Dennis, I also support moving this to the IETF. And on the IANA registry, one thing I've noticed, a lot of the OpenID Connect specs, I think they're registering using specification required. So that seems to work.
John Bradley, I'm involved both places. I'd be happy to work on this here. I think it's a useful thing. It's just easier, I think, because of the IANA registry issue. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't make very much difference which place we did it.
So are there any objections to having this as a working group document running with?
Well, there isn't a draft for just this right now, so I don't know if we can ask exactly that question, just from a procedural standpoint. But I'd be happy to make an ID that is focusing on this and then submit it for that.
So you were planning to take it out of draft Backman?
Yeah, I already took it out of draft Backman Secevent token and put it in whatever the name for the risk document is right now. I'm happy to pull it out of there and put it in something else, put it in its own document.
Okay, so I'm not hearing any objections. Annabelle, please publish an individual draft with this material, and we will probably progress it to a working group document.
Great.
Oh, we can, yeah. So let's do it like that from day one.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I had two things that, and the remaining 35 minutes, we probably don't need all of that. Annabelle, would you like to speak about the expiration claim?
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. So for context, the expiration claim, the JOT expiration claim, in the set draft today, the guidance on that is not recommended. And the rationale behind that is the statements being made by the security event or token about the security event don't really expire. Reality doesn't expire, which is generally hopefully true. And so putting an expiration on that doesn't necessarily make sense. The counter argument to that is expiration plays an important role in indicating to the recipient of a JOT how long they need to worry about caching JTIs for collisions and honoring the JOT in general. And the further argument is that the expiration is not a statement about the data within the JOT. It's a statement about the JOT itself. So by putting an expiration in a security event token, what you're saying is this token expires. This token should no longer be interpreted or accepted after this point. That has no inherent statement about whether or not what it says is still true.
But I think Marius made a somewhat different claim about caching of identities.
Yeah,
that was his original motivation here.
Yeah, that's the first claim
okay.
I brought up. That
Yeah.
If you're trying to validate whether or not you've seen a JOT before, you're probably doing that by tracking JTIs that you've seen. You don't want to hang on to JTIs forever. So what's your TTL for that cache, basically?
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I replied to Marius about this on list at the beginning of our time, but he's proposing a layering violation. The set should be valid and the same no matter which transport is used. He is proposing adding a claim or using a claim in the set in a transport specific way. If the transport protocol uses caching as a cache lifetime hint. Whereas if you look at most transport protocols that do support caching, HTTP being probably one of the most well-known, the caching information is provided as protocol headers, not in the content being communicated. So you don't add stuff to the HTTP body about caching. You add stuff to the HTTP headers. That's specified by the transport. Similarly, we should not be injecting transport-specific information into the set because that's a layering violation. So the spec already has it right.
Phil Hunt, I was just going to say the same thing.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I think we're misapplying the word caching here. I think I know it was used in the email thread. I don't think we're actually talking about caching here. We're talking about the record of which JTIs you've seen, and therefore which sets you can throw out, or which JOTs in general you can throw out, or which JOTs you shouldn't necessarily trust. You don't want to have to maintain JTIs forever. You don't want this endlessly growing database of JTIs that you've seen. You want to be able to expire those records. Otherwise, it doesn't scale. The question then becomes, what's your expiration time on those records? How long do you have to hang on to a JTI for before you can safely get rid of it? With expiration baked into the token, that gives you an out. Because after that expiration time, you're going to ignore that JOT whether or not you've seen the JTI before, because it's expired. So that gives you an upper bound for what your expiration time, or a lower bound for what your expiration time needs to be. So yeah, it was called caching. It's not really caching.
Phil Hunt, is it working? The concern I have here is that sets are statements about state changes that occurred in the issuer. We're not making commands, we're not making security assertions, and we're trying to treat them as commands and assertions, which brings up the issue of how long do I keep it for, how long is it good for? The reason there is no expiry is we're saying something occurred in the past. So the past doesn't expire, it's a statement of record. That was the key reason we started SET, was to differentiate from access tokens in this regard in a very strong way. So but that said, people are free to use it however they want, but I don't see if Annabelle's saying that where the interop issue, it's up to the receiver based on how they're using it to decide how to mitigate the problem. At the level the spec is written, I can't see how we would solve this in an interop way for a specific use like this. So caching GTIs doesn't make sense because the premise always has been you get a trigger, you throw it away, you're done.
But do we care at all about replay protection?
I don't think so. But it's not the same kind of idempotence you would expect because it depends on what the receiver decides to do that. And in the introductory text, we made it clear that the receiver decides their own actions, and therefore the consequences of their actions determine whether a replay attack is possible or not. That's how I read it. Because we're not issuing a command, we're not issuing an assertion like a logon assertion. This is a different animal. So there shouldn't be a replay attack because we're not asking somebody to do something. We're not changing a state explicitly. The receiver is the one that decides what to do and what action to take. Therefore, the actions they take could trigger a replay attack, but that's of their own making.
Do we foresee reasonable receivers doing stuff with sets that we need to help them with replay protection?
We've already provided the Mike Jones, Microsoft. We've already provided the JTI value such that if they want to detect replay, they can do so. So we've done that. That being said, and again, I said this on list, but since we're discussing this in the room, I'll say it again, because sets are factual statements about something that occurred. We would be architecturally in a very strange place if we were to encourage deployers to make up an arbitrary expiration time about something which remains true forever. We should not be like encouraging sort of random values to be generated. Now, particular use cases and transport protocols probably can and will have time values that are used in particular ways, but it may not be expiration. It might be based on the issued time, which again is a true thing that doesn't change. There's deltas that lots of protocols use, but it would be a layering violation for us to try to jam that into the JOT.
Hi, channeling Marius again. Transport was used as an example to guide the value of EXP expiration. No transport injection was meant. Such replay attacks are a real issue regardless of transport method.
Annabelle Beckman, Amazon. I think it's dangerous for us to make any claims that replay attacks aren't going to be relevant. Yes, theoretically, a receiver could keep a record of every JTI they've ever seen. That won't scale. There's a reason expiration is in JOT and not ID token. It's clearly intended to be there for more than just assertion token use cases. And I think the use case we're talking about here is very much in line with what is described within JOT itself.
John Bradley, I'm going to disagree with Mike slightly. The reason why we added JTI was to be able to detect receiving the same token multiple times without having to sniff through lots of different fields. So that, sometimes that's a security concern. Sometimes it's just you may wind up having processing errors, processing the same thing twice. The expiry was intended to be you should not receive process this token if you receive it after this time. Not that the content of the token is invalid, which is, I think, that the information in the token is no longer valid, which I think was the point that that some people were making. But if you don't have some period at which point you will no longer process the token based on time, then as Annabelle points out, you have an infinite list of JTIs that you must keep. And that just isn't practical from a deployment point of view. So there is, when JTI was created in light of having the expiry time, the interrelationship of those, as pointed out, is that it's not a layering violation. It's how long do you need to keep that list of JTIs to successfully detect duplicates. I think that's a perfectly fair use for it. I think we may need to be clear that you shouldn't interpret the expiry as being the information contained in it's no longer valid. It's just that you can't receive it anymore for processing reasons, which is sort of the way that we sort of simplified some of the many fields in SAML, not on or after and various other things, into expiry. But expiry is intended to be the processing time for the token, not when the information expires.
Mike Jones again. And again, I said this on list, but it's fine for profiles to say that they're going to use the expiration claim in a particular way, including the way that John or Marius are describing. But the reason I'm reacting so strongly is Marius was proposing making it mandatory. And there's plenty of use cases where that's the wrong thing to do. I'm not against using the field. I'm against jamming it down people's throats. We already got it right. Profiles can already use the field if they want to.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. I think my concern with that is currently the draft says it's not recommended. I would honestly say let's just strike the content in the draft that refers to EXP and let the text that's in JOT stand as guidance for that.
Mike, responding directly to that, one of the problems with striking that is there's other places in the draft where we had working group consensus to use the lack of EXP as one of the ways of clearly breaking any ID token implementations so that there couldn't be confusion even in the absence of explicit typing. And so if we're going to keep our ID token differentiation rule, we have to allow this to be optional.
Annabelle Backman again responding. There's also other mechanisms for differentiating those. In some cases, providers probably have to use something like EXP omission to protect against the ID token mimicking scenarios. I think other scenarios they won't need to. I think we can have that guidance without saying that EXP is not recommended, full stop for sets. I think it's primarily that not recommended language that I'm objecting to, and I can't speak for Marius on that, whether he'd be fine with just removing that.
And I would be fine going as far as just saying it's optional, but making it must, that's just wrong.
I'm on board with that.
Ben Kaduk. So I guess I have a question that is somewhat hypothetical, but perhaps interesting to consider. So if we consider the case where EXP is present and it's used to, for the replay protection purposes, and I as a receiver know for some reason that I have not processed this event before, perhaps due to issuance time, and I haven't been processing for a while. If I trust the expiration claim, then I should not process that event, but I know I have not processed it, and perhaps I want to. What options do I have?
Yeah, I think that's a good reason why we shouldn't use it that way at all.
Well, so one particular path would be if I could give it to the set issuer and say, is this still valid can you reissue it with a later expiration time?
Cutting it for Marius. So recommending against EXP is the issue, and yes, differentiating against ID tokens is an open issue. I did not ask for EXP to be a must.
We'll cut the line after Annabelle.
Mike, the reason I said he was asking that it be a must is in the email thread, Marius asked, should we require its use? That's a must.
Yeah, and it could be should.
So the other potential alternative is to have an explicit expiry of the JTI, which could be a new claim, which would then be more explicit about solving the confusion about what expiry actually means. So that should also be considered as an option, and would let us say something like, if you're sending a JTI, you should say how long you need to maintain that JTI for before it's I'm not going to send it again. So there are potentially other solutions that could be looked at.
The reason EXP was not recommended was a group decision, and at the time the group decision is that we were not using it the way JWT defines it, and nor would we redefine it. We made a lot of changes to stop redefinition of JWT claims. So I would, as your editor, counsel strongly against changing that text at all. I would prefer, if we have to put it in the set, a new attribute be defined for this new purpose, assuming we can come to an agreement on it. This strikes me as more of a transmission issue, and I think it maybe should be in the HTTP layer as part of the caching header recommendation. It's not really part of the set. We're in the publication process, and yanking it back doesn't seem to be that smart, because we just open the doors again and we're not finishing and we're not moving ahead.
Let me clarify this point. So the document is going into IETF last call, where everybody can make comments, including ourselves, of course. We would have liked, or we would like, the document to be closed as far as the working group before that, but we are free to make smaller changes without interrupting the flow, without interrupting the workflow. If we make larger changes, and it's our decision, we might need to start the process anew. I think for a small change around a single claim, we can just do it in our stride. It's not ideal, I agree.
Yeah. So yeah, I want to caution about that. I feel that the replay and the caching things are going to be different from push than from pull, and that's why I would prefer it in an HTTP header, because you may have a different recommendation. You expect push to happen, delivery instantaneously, so if you don't process it in the next few minutes, you should probably ignore it. Whereas pull, if you're only picking it up every once an hour, then it's a different expectation. So it seems to have, you have more flexibility if it's an HTTP. Thanks.
If I understand it correctly, a lot of it's about the policy on the receiver side being able to say, based on the JTI, how long they want to remember those in order to not duplicate process things, in order to policy or replay prevention or whatever. And using expiry is a pretty well-defined pattern for that in other contexts like single sign-on. But I don't think it necessarily is necessary here or applicable here, where there's already sufficient information, I think, in what's provided to accomplish the same goals based on the policy of the receiver. And that is the JTI is there, and the IAT, the issued value, is required in the token now. So a receiver could set up its own policy based on whatever its needs or profile is to say that I will only accept tokens or accept sets, that have been issued within the last hour, 2 hours, whatever is appropriate for the delivery mechanism, and then expire them not expire them, purge, remember the JTIs for that period of time. So I think that there's sufficient information already available to implement the kind of policy that Marius is looking for through the introduction of EXP without using EXP at all, but relying more on the issued time of the token itself, and maintaining its own internal policy around how to do that. And that also takes any onus off of the sender to dictate to the receiver how long it needs to remember things or anything like that. It puts all the role of the policy and the needs on the system that's going to be dealing with it.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Just to clarify again, since apparently there's still ambiguity around that, no one is advocating use of the EXP claim in caching systems whatsoever. Nowhere. Nobody has suggested that if the word caching has been used, it was a misuse of that word. We're not talking about caching. On that note, as far as I'm aware, HTTP has never been concerned with issues of replay attacks. That's not something that we try to address at that level. And bear in mind, we're not introducing expiry here. Expiry was introduced in JOT. What we're saying is there are valid use cases for using expiry as it's defined in JOT with sets. The question is then, is there actually a strong argument at the set level to say, no, you can't use expiry, or no, you shouldn't use expiry as it's described in JOT when working with sets? And I don't really see that here.
Channeling Marius again, two separate comments. First, separate claim sounds good. JTI expiration is not transport specific. A claim that defines JTI expiration belongs next to the JTI, not in a different layer. And the second thing, much newer, transmitters have...
Sorry, we're done here.
Transmitters have retry strategies and periods that the receiver cannot easily take into account if it decides on its own for how long to track JTI.
All right, so to conclude this discussion, I don't think, well, we obviously are not ready to take a hum on anything concrete. I think it's clear that the sense of the room is that there is an issue, and we'll take it back to the list and make a decision, and the decision may involve a small change to the document while it's going through ISG processing. Last on my list of optional things to do, Phil, would you like to say a few words about the document you submitted tonight?
Okay, Phil here. I was thinking about this problem that we spent a lot of time today on talking about with regards to MTI. A week ago or so, I looked at how do we change optionality of methods to solve the problem of HTTP client, who can be server. So I took the draft that we had and merged the two methods into something that's now called, that I've called symmetric set transfer protocol. It actually turns out that a lot of things peel away and simplify. At least the draft is smaller. It's symmetric in the sense that the parameters used in request and response are the same regardless of which direction you're sending. We also end up with the possibility of having not only push mode, pull mode, but now you can do push-pull, which means if you get to the point where we have a lot of cases for bidirectional communication, you can have that. The key benefit, though, is we change optionality in the spec from two completely separate methods to one method that, understandably, from the standard perspective of push, is slightly more complex because you have the ability to send more than one set in one post, but that's really the only change. in the previous delivery draft. The error signaling remains the same from the delivery draft. Everything else is unchanged. It's almost 95% backwards compatible for poll. The one parameter I changed, I simplified one parameter that was there. The max events was changed to return events, so it's a Boolean now. Nothing else new was introduced. So I'm not saying it's the solution, but it might be a compromise that gets us to a single method that can be deployed in both cases. Your choice here is to choose whether you want to be a client or a server, not which protocol you use. So information can flow either way, independent of which HTTP mode you're running in. So that's one possibility, and I throw that out there. You know, I understand that the push people aren't that thrilled with it. So, but it does get us to a cleaner single MTI, I think. So it's there and it's on the table, and I invite you to look at it. It's now published.
Yeah, and I see push people not lining up, and I suggest we do not discuss SSTP now. It was just now, just to yesterday submitted. We're not ready to discuss it now,
Even if we're familiar with it?
even those who are familiar with that, because the room needs to be familiar with it for an effective discussion.
Can I give an advisory comment?
Please don't.
I do want to apologize to the group for not releasing it earlier. There was the closed zone time, but I wanted the discussion to proceed on the current draft. I still support the delivery draft going forward if it can. And I did not want to distract, but a number of people encouraged me yesterday to get it on the table. So there it is.
Anything else? Any other issues? If not, then we're done. Thank you very much. Oh, yes.